Well, good evening. My name is Jared. I have the privilege of being the executive director and lead pastor of this family of churches called the Sacred Grace. It's an absolute joy to be here at Inglewood tonight. The series that we're in is a series that's an annual reminder of the values that we share as a family of churches and really the framework that we have chosen together. It's a paradigm for our family of churches about how do we choose to follow the way of Jesus. We talk about moving up, moving in, and moving out. And when we say we move in, there's in some ways this double in. We move both in towards ourselves and we also move in towards each other. Last week, Nathan taught about moving in towards each other relationally and about the capacity we have to be relationally rooted to a limited number of people. But tonight I want to share about how do we move in towards ourselves. I'm going to be sharing on a topic that I've probably read more about than any other topic over the last 20-some years of ministry because it is something of deep importance to me. And so I'm going to try to summarize about a decade of reading in about 15 minutes of talking. So we'll see how that goes. But more than what I have to share, my prayer is that you would hear the voice of God about who you are. And the Spirit would communicate to your soul about who you are. And so the teaching text tonight that we're going to begin with is Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16. It'll be up on the screen if you'd like to read along. Paul writes this, I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and how long and how high and how deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So if I were to ask you, where is your soul located? What would you say? Maybe you didn't think about that today while you were watching the Broncos. But what is that part of you that makes you you? Like, where is that? Where is that part of you that is not the physical part of you, the part that can't be inspected or dissected or found on a cadaver once it is gone? There are two primary views in the historic Christian tradition about that which is not our body, the being that makes us, that's not our body. And one is based on the being of ourselves in three parts, body, soul, and spirit, and that's called tripartite. The other is that our being is in two parts, a body and soul are called bipartite. Now, this argument's been going on for a couple of centuries, so we probably aren't going to get it sorted out tonight. But either way, there is something that we agree on in which there is an inner being. There is something beyond the body that makes you, you, and that makes me, me. But so maybe more pertinent to the question this evening is how much time and attention do you and do I spend discovering and developing and deepening that part of you? What does it mean to be rooted in your inner being? The faith tradition that I grew up in, I'm the son of a Southern Baptist preacher, just to get that out, seemed to avoid this line of questioning and this line of thinking. I went into my undergrad studying psychology, and it was incredibly troubling for me, even at a fairly young age, the lack of self-awareness that was quickly evident in many of the faith leaders of the churches that I grew up in. There was a clear priority given to the spiritual self. Actually, I would say about 99% of the talks that I ever heard in my 20 years of attending church 3 times a week were about the spiritual self, that part of you that was either going to heaven or to hell. And occasionally there was a mention of the physical self primarily in relating to morality as it had to do with your spiritual self. But there was an incredible neglect, I would say, or lack of attention to the emotional or the soulful part of the self, that inner being. And to neglect that inner being, that inner life, about being rooted inwards, I believe is to miss one of the greatest mysteries of the entire universe, which is you. You and the person sitting next to you are one of the most incredible mysteries of the universe. I recently got done reading a book by Philip Yancey and Dr. Paul Brand about the human body. And in one of the chapters, they begin to expand on the neuroplasticity and the neuroscience of the human brain. So you just geek out with me for just a moment here, because the amazing mystery that exists inside of you in your neurobiology should promote some sense of awe and wonder. In the same way that the night sky, when you're in Breckenridge with some friends and there's no lights and you look up and you see, 2% of the known galaxy, when you look inside at who God has created you to be and the neuroscience that is all going on in your brain right now, and that only 1% of your entire brain is given to all of that which is coming in externally and running all of your operations, and another 99% of all of the neurosynapses in your brain are actually having to do with meaning and truth and beauty and memory, what you come to recognize is that there is something deep going on in your inner being. And to not pay attention to it for your entire life would be an incredible loss. In the book, they quote Roger Sperry, the award winner of the 1981 Nobel Prize, and he says this: "In the human head, there are forces within forces within forces, as in no other cubic half-foot of the universe we know." Paul Brand goes on to write, "The complexity in the head defies description, with the total number of connections far exceeding the number of galaxies in the universe. A mere gram of brain tissue may contain as many as 4 billion synaptic junctions." So this inner being, which, a pun would be to call it inner space, is as vast as the universe is in the outer space. And discovering this inner being, I believe, is incredibly critical to our life and our meaning, because I believe in that inner being is the basis of your identity. One of the most ancient prayers that I pray every day is a prayer of St. Francis. Francis was known to go away for months at a time, and when he would come back, all of the people of the village were really fascinated by this kind of spiritual being that would go away for months at a time and pray, and they would ask him, "So Francis, what did you pray?" And he would say, "I prayed 2 things. Who are you? Who am I?" Who are you and who am I? It echoes the prayer of Augustine, one of the church fathers. In very bad Latin, it says, "Novum te, novum me," which is, may I know me and may I know you. The saints over the centuries come to the same conclusion. Thomas Merton, in his book, New Seeds of Contemplation, writes this: "There's only one problem on which all my existence, my peace, and my happiness depend: to discover myself in discovering God. If I find him, I will find myself, and if I find my true self, I will find him." What does it mean to be rooted in your inner being? What does it mean to look on the inner self? David in the Psalms predates all of these. Psalm 51, "Behold, you delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret place." He writes again in Psalm 139, "For you formed my inward part. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and I'm wonderfully made." So where do we begin in exploring and understanding our inner being? I think we begin here, that we are not our own origin. You and I were made in the same ways that the galaxies and the universes were made. In fact, we were made. You and I were made, from my perspective, in love, by love, for love. David Benner writes this in his book, The Gift of Being Yourself: "Personhood is not an accomplishment, it is a gift." And herein lies, I think, the major difference in the Christian worldview and pretty much every other worldview that's running right now. Is your identity one that has been given to you by a loving God, or is your identity something that you are working hard at crafting and creating on your own? This book, The Gift of Being Yourself, is the one book that I would recommend probably more than any other about the inward journey. It's a book that I reread every year, because what he is saying is, to understand who we are, we have to understand that our being, our inner self, is in fact a gift given to us. So go back to Paul's prayer that we read tonight out of Ephesians. Paul writes to a church that he had planted in the city called Ephesus, and he says, "I pray that in your inner being you are rooted in love." The vast nature of being loved by Christ and his love for you is beyond all knowledge, Paul continues. And so he says your inner being, your inner life, your inner self, the most true thing about who you are is that you are rooted in love, is that you are loved. The most true thing about you is that you are the beloved of God. And that's probably the one thing that somehow I didn't hear in 20 years of growing up in a church. That the truest thing about me wasn't the second most true thing about me, but the first most true thing about me was that I was loved. We'll get to the second most true thing about me in about a minute. But the first most true thing about me is that I was loved by God. And so here's the first and most maybe important question for some of you tonight. Do I believe that my core identity, that I am loved, that I am the beloved of God? I would say if there is any point of like conversion, of beginning to believe in the message of Jesus, it's that you begin to understand and hold and receive that you are the beloved of God. I would say this is where the fork in the road is. Seems to be all of Jesus' interactions with people were about him wanting them to understand that they, in fact, were the beloved of God. So if, in fact, the most true thing about me is that I am loved, the second most true thing about me is that there are wounds in my inner being. That because of my sin and the sin of others, there is casualties on my soul. And what we begin to learn is that the ignored and the shame parts of ourselves become stronger, not weaker in time. All of that parts of our being that operate out of sight and out of mind and unseen have a funny way of sneaking into our unconscious, and they have an increasing influence over what we believe about ourselves and what we believe about others. And they even have a way of sneaking into all of our daily practices and habits, completely unbeknownst to us. And we thought that we had like all the parts of who we wanted at the table, and we had kept all the parts of us that we didn't particularly like not at the table. And what we recognize is those parts of our being that were wounded, or where we wounded someone else that we haven't invited to the table, end up having a very loud voice into who we believe that we are. They keep us from being rooted in love. And so what we come to learn is that we have to do this soul work, this deep work, not only of trusting that we're beloved, but also that we are willing to move into these spaces of where we are wounded. For me, that means that I've been in counseling for well over a decade. But last year, there was an hour of counseling that was probably one of the most deeply healing moments of my story. It was a session in which an 84-year-old man invited me as a 45-year-old Jared to have a conversation with the 5-year-old Jared. The conversation was about abuse that I had experienced as a child. Abuse that I had hid in shame of for 40 years. Anytime the conversation would come up, I would quickly dismiss it and defend that it was not nearly as tragic or as deep as what had happened to people who were dear to me. And so it felt appropriately dismissed. But any time that I would try to do any amount of soul work of being the beloved, of being rooted and loved, there was this wound in my soul that I couldn't quite get around because I was just trying to keep it ignored and dismissed. And so the counselor, in his gracious wisdom, carefully prompted a conversation through these moments of embarrassment and pain and shame. And there was this compassion and there was this care of coming alongside this part of my identity, which was a very afraid little 5-year-old part of me that I had been hiding for decades. And then in one of the most, that I can only explain as the most profound moments of my life, he invited into my past imagination, not just a 45-year-old Jared and the 5-year-old Jared having a conversation, but he invited Jesus into the room. And in that moment, there was some sort of healing in my inner being that I, for the better part of 4 decades, did not believe was possible. And I understood that when Paul wrote, like, I deeply want you to be rooted in love, that wasn't just a hyperbole, but that could be a reality. And so there is this moment in which self-awareness is only the beginning because it begins to move towards self-transformation. Culturally, I would say we are more than willing for people to be self-aware. The question is, after you're aware, what happens next? And without Jesus, there is very little hope of transformation of what you are aware of. So the second question is, what parts of my identity or my inner being do I need to explore, accept, and forgive? I deeply believe that if we are to lead ourselves or if we are to lead others, we first have to come to love ourselves. We have to accept ourselves, which includes the woundedness that we have caused as well as the woundedness that has occurred to our own soul. Let me close with this. I do not believe that soul work is exclusively mental work. It's not just emotional work done in the counselor's office. I've spent a lot of time on counselors' couches, and I would offer that there are some practices that I have participated in that are as important to my inner being, to knowing myself, as all of the counseling sessions that I have sat in. Those include hiring a CrossFit trainer for a year to do a project called a man revival because of my graduating high school at 95 pounds and 5'3" and not believing I would ever be able to bench press a 45-pound bar in a gym. I was like, all right, so here's the deal. Like, we're finally going to head this thing off straight on. Head this straight off. It was, there's mixed metaphors there. So I hired this guy for a year because I told him, I was like, there's only one thing I want to do. I just want to be able to bench press a bar with plates on it in a gym because there is some part of my being that needs to believe that I was created in the image of God as a male. There are other parts of me that I'm coming to know about being rooted in who I am is playing catch with my daughter. We were at the park today. And I can't figure out why, but she asks me on a regular basis, did you do this with your daddy? And she keeps asking, and the answer is the same, no. And I think it may be that my 10-year-old is helping me understand my inner being, right? And soul work that's necessary. And soul work that's necessary about waking up every morning before the sun gets up and lighting a candle and doing breath prayer, which is simply breathing in and out and believing that life is grace and that I and that you and that all of us are the beloved. I think one of the deepest marks of a mature and a rooted soul is gratitude. Ronald Rolheiser, in his epic book, Sacred Fire, writes this: live in gratitude and thank your Creator by enjoying your life. Probably one of the greatest practices that you could practice for your inner being is to enjoy the life that your Creator has given to you. That your personhood is a gift, but also your life is a gift, and so enjoy it. Love is rooted in gratitude, and gratitude is the soil in which we grow out of. The truest thing about us is that we are loved. It is also true that in our inner being, it's vast and it requires exploring and discovering, accepting and forgiving those wounded parts of our soul. But I believe, maybe most importantly, are how do we begin to live into the practices that move us inward to deepen this part of our being. I read this book this year. It's called Atomic Habits by a guy named James Clear. He talks about habit tracking. For those of you who are obsessive about making lists, this is the best thing ever. You basically just track everything that you do every day. But it's spectacular because for me, it began to put a framework on this practice of a rule of life that I've been living for about 7 years. And it began to say, what are the things that I do every day that are important, like soul work? And so I have daily habits that make up this rule of life, and they're pretty simple things. Like they begin with like this: morning prayer before 6 a.m. Good food. That's not always easy for some of us. Meaningful conversation. Deep work, which means 2 hours of work without any notifications, blinking red things to distract me, because meaningful work is important for me. Afternoon walk with my dog. My spiritual director, as I call him, is a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, and we take a walk, and he teaches me more about the joy of life than any person that I interact with all day long. And these are simple practices, but I can tell you at the end of the day, the more of these daily practices that I have done, because I am discovering who I am at this point, the more that I am living into the true being that I think God has called and created me to be, which is rooted in love. As a single parent, as a pastor, as a middle-aged male, somebody who cares deeply about words and appreciates meaningful work, I have come to understand who it is that God has created and called me to be. And I would invite you to begin to think through, like, what are the practices that would deepen the rootedness of your inner being? We've been talking about this formula throughout the series. It's time and intention and grace equals being rooted. Time, intention, and grace equals rootedness. And so what is the intention? What are the practices that are deepening the rootedness of your inner being? If you have no idea of where to start, let me encourage you to read a book called The Gift of Being Yourself by David Benner. Secondly, let me encourage you, take a walk every day. My mother, when my father passed away, she said, Jared, I just don't even know who I am anymore. They had been married for 54 years. And so I started doing spiritual direction for my mother. And I said, all right, Mom, here's where we're going to start. We're going to have one meaningful conversation a day. We're going to take a walk every day. We're going to eat a good meal every day. And we're going to say thank you to God that you're still here and that you get to enjoy life. Which, by the way, doing spiritual direction for your mom, it's the greatest thing ever. Weirdest thing ever, but the greatest thing ever. So what are the practices for you? If you have no idea where to start beyond reading a book, ask Nathan, ask a trusted friend. I would be honored to meet with you and ask you questions about what does it look like to move inward and to look inward. Jesus asked the best questions. Mostly I just steal his, which are like, what are you looking for? What do you want? But let me end here. This is why I believe being rooted in who God created us to be, moving into this inner being and our soul matters so much. It's a thought from Dallas Willard. He's the philosopher and author who recently passed away. And I think this thought every week when we pray this prayer of generosity, because we begin the prayer by saying, we bring nothing into this world and we take nothing out of it. And the first is true. We bring nothing into this world. Like our simple and elaborate and mysterious self, we didn't show up with it. It was a gift to us. But the second might not actually be 100% true, because Willard says this: the only thing you take into eternity with you is all you have become. And so what does it look like to receive the gift of who you are, your identity as the beloved? What does it mean to do the inner work of both the wounds and the grace and the gift of all of your life? And what does it look to end your life, that what you would take out of this life, and maybe the only thing that you take out of this life, is that you are rooted in love, that you are the beloved of God, and that you have explored that vast universe that's inside of you throughout your days and throughout your years. Would you pray with me? Father, thanks for tonight, for this community, and for a people who continue to love you and be loved by you, to be led by you. We pray that we would be rooted in your love. We pray this in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Amen.